Perfect. The saga begins in Tacoma, Washington, behind a boulder near a small outcropping shack. Jesus, spelled however you damn feel that day, is the central figure, haunted, wandering, a survivor who doesn't know he's a veteran of a war most Americans never even heard of. He was a child of the 1970s, born in the early to mid 1960s, which puts the peak of his trauma squarely in the blood and ash years of Mexico's dirty war. I'll now begin crafting the first chapters of a long Wilbur Smith-style saga, fully grounded in the verified atrocities, political history, and emotional truths you and Jesus have brought into focus. I'll return shortly with the opening narrative structure and a first scene draft. Shash from war-torn highlands to Tacoma, the saga of Jesus. Tacoma, Washington. Present-day edge in Tacoma, Jesus crouches behind a mossy boulder, the damp scent of pine and earth heavy in the air. A small wooden house perches on a rocky outcrop just ahead, its windows glowing with faint light in the evening drizzle. Jesus's heart thumps steadily as he presses his back to the cold stone, memories of distant mountains and gunfire swirling in his mind. He has tracked a ghost from his past to this quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest, and the moment of reckoning is close. Rain drips from the cedar branches overhead, pattering on Jesus's worn jacket. It is 2025, and nearly 4 decades have passed since the war that forever altered the trajectory of his life. Yet, in this moment, time feels folded. The dense Washington forest around him triggers memories of other forests, jungles where he once hid as a boy, terrified, not yet understanding what war truly meant. Back then, he had no concept of money or modern life, only the simple rhythm of village days. Now he's a man of almost 55, hardened by history, preparing for a confrontation he neither sought nor could avoid. Inside the outcropping house, a figure moves. The very man Jesus has been hunting, a man who likely believes his violent past was buried overseas. Jesus closes his eyes briefly and steadies his breathing. In the silence, his mind drifts back to where it all began, to a remote highland village thousands of miles away. Before he can face the present, he must relive the past. Clenching his fists, Jesus lets the rain-soaked night fade into memory, and he recalls the world of his childhood. Highlands of Guatemala, early 1980s. Jesus was born in a small Mayan village nestled in the Sierra Madre highlands of Guatemala. The year was 1970, placing his childhood amid one of the most turbulent periods of his country's history. In Jesus's earliest memories, life in the village was simple and insulated. His family were subsistence farmers. They traded corn, beans, and coffee beans with neighbors, rarely seeing a quetzal or peso in coin. As a little boy, Jesus had no idea what money was. In their tiny agrarian world, barter and mutual help sustained them. What few coins his father earned selling a pig at the distant market never made much sense to young Jesus. Value was measured in sacks of maize or the weight of firewood, not in currency. He roamed barefoot under the cloud forest canopies, innocent to the conflicts beyond their valley. But beyond those green mountains, a brutal civil war raged. Since the 1960s, the Guatemalan government had been locked in conflict with leftist guerrilla fighters. By the time Jesus was a child, the war had escalated into a scorched earth campaign. In the early 1980s, General Efrain Rios Mont's regime unleashed a wave of violence that engulfed the indigenous villages. Whole communities were targeted on the mere suspicion of aiding rebels. The army, heavily backed by powerful allies from abroad, swept through rural departments like a storm of fire. In total, an estimated 200,000 people were killed during the 36-year civil war, and some 626 villages were perpetrated largely against Mayan indigenous communities. This horrifying campaign, law as a genocide, reached Jesus's home when he was barely 12 years old. It was a gray morning in 1982 when the war arrived in their valley. Jesus remembers the distant thump of helicopter blades echoing off the hills. Villagers paused in their daily chores, looking up at the sky in confusion and dread. Soldiers in dusty trucks soon rolled into the village plaza. What happened next unfolded in a blur of chaos that would haunt Jesus's nightmares for a lifetime. The army unit, led by a hard-faced officer barking orders in Spanish, gathered the villagers and accused them of harboring guerrilleros. Jesus clung to his mother's hand, peering from behind her woven shawl. He didn't fully understand the words, but he understood the fear in his parents' eyes. Suddenly, the soldiers opened fire. Men, women, and children screamed and scattered. Jesus's father threw himself in front of the family, shouting for them to run. The crackle of gunfire and acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Jesus saw his father crumple to the ground, struck by bullets. His mother yanked him back toward their hut as soldiers began torching the thatched roofs. Flames leapt from home to home. Jesus heard the agonized wails of neighbors and the roar of soldiers' voices. In the chaos, his mother pushed him into a narrow crawl space under the raised floor of their hut. Escondete, mijo! Hide, my son, she whispered, her voice urgent. Through the slats, Jesus watched in horror as a soldier seized his mother's arm. There was a flash of a machete, and her shawl fell empty to the mud. Jesus pressed his hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. In a matter of minutes, his entire world was reduced to blood and ash. Huddled under the splintered floorboards, he trembled violently. The heat of the fires grew unbearable, and smoke choked his lungs. At some point, he lost consciousness, and only the stillness of night woke him. The soldiers were gone, leaving silence and corpses in their wake. Jesus crawled out to a scene of devastation, huts smoldering, the plaza littered with bodies of people he'd known all his life. By the faint moonlight, he recognized his mother's form among them and collapsed beside her, tears carving tracks in the soot on his face. The massacre of his village was one of many in those years of scorched earth. Rios Mont's forces had sought to drain the fish, eradicating entire communities to eliminate any support for insurgents. They left behind orphaned children like Jesus as unwitting witnesses. In the coming years, truth commissions would reveal the full horror. Villages bludgeoned, burned, and bulldozed off the map. But on that night, all Jesus knew was that he was utterly in shock, digging a shallow pit with his bare hands to cover his parents' bodies with earth and stones. At 12 years old, Jesus became a child survivor of war, one of the few from his village. Hunger and grief gnawed at him, but a spark of determination flared within. His mother had died saving him, and he must honor that by living. Gathering a small sack of whatever dried corn and clothing he could scavenge from the ruins, Jesus set out on foot. He had heard whispers from elders about heading north to escape the army, about a place called Mexico. With nothing left behind him but ghosts, the boy turned toward the mountains that led to the border. Every step away from his charred village was a step into the unknown. Across the border. Jesus trekked for days through dense cloud forest and across rushing mountain streams. He kept off the main paths, moving cautiously to avoid army patrols. Other survivors from nearby massacred villages were also fleeing. Now and then, Jesus encountered frightened families hiding in the jungle. They shared what little food they had and pointed him in the direction of the Mexican border. The journey was perilous. Army units sometimes pursued fleeing refugees, even into the wild. Once at twilight, Jesus heard the distant pop of gunshots and screams on a parallel trail. Another group ambushed. He spent that night curled in the hollow of an old tree, shaking in terror that the soldiers would find him. On the 5th day of his escape, weak from hunger, Jesus reached the rio that marked the border with Mexico. He was not alone. A small band of refugees, mostly women and children, waded across the muddy river alongside him. A woman helped Jesus onto the opposite bank and gave him a scrap of tortilla. Though he was thin and ragged, his youthful face and wide eyes earned him sympathy among these strangers. They all shared the same haunted look of those who had seen unimaginable horrors. One elderly man gently asked Jesus where his family was. Jesus could only shake his head, tears welling, and the man understood. Everyone in that group had left loved ones behind in freshly dug graves. In Mexico, they were met eventually by representatives of an international refugee agency and Mexican volunteers. By the mid-1980s, about 45,000 Guatemalans had fled the civil war into southern Mexico. Jesus was swept into one of the sprawling refugee camps set up in Chiapas, just named La Gloria, became his new home, a far cry from the verdant tranquility of his village. Here, rows of makeshift huts constructed from plastic tarps and bamboo crowded a muddy clearing. Women and children made up the majority of the camp's inhabitants. Most of the men were either killed or still fighting, which left camps full of widows and orphans. Jesus, at 13, was one of many war children suddenly growing up in exile. Life in La Gloria camp was a Dale's survival. Food was scarce and tightly controlled by officials. The refugees were not allowed to farm the fertile land around the camp. The Mexican authorities, under pressure to contain the refugee crisis, forbade them from planting crops. Instead, they were handed rations of basic supplies, which often came late or infrequently due to corruption and mismanagement at dawn with a dented tin bowl for whatever the day's provisions might be. In one 3-month period in 1984, each refugee received only about 1 kilograms of dried fish, 2 kilograms of beans, 1 kilograms of powdered milk, and 12 kilograms of cornmeal, barely enough for 2 weeks of sustenance. Malnutrition and illness stalked the camp. Jesus frequently went to sleep on an empty stomach, his belly aching with hunger. For a boy who had grown wing what money was, the camp introduced harsh new realities. He watched as aid workers transacted with Mexican vendors and puzzled over the coins and paper bills that changed hands. Once, an aid worker tried to give Jesus a few pesos to buy soap, and he simply stared at the unfamiliar coins, unsure of their use, until a kindly older girl showed him how to trade them for goods. It was in the refugee camp that Jesus first understood the power and necessity of money, a concept that had been meaningless in his self-sufficient village life. Despite the hardships, La Gloria offered one precious thing: relative safety from the killing. Still, the refugees lived in fear that the Guatemalan army might one day cross into Mexico to eliminate survivors. Rumors occasionally swept the camp of nighttime incursions. At times, Jesus jolted awake from nightmares, convinced he heard soldiers' footsteps outside the tent. The he had witnessed would stay with him, but amid the community of fellow refugees, he also found fragments of hope. Children played soccer with balls of tied rags, women formed prayer circles and sang soft lullabies at night, and the camp's makeshift school tent taught Spanish and basic skills to those who wanted to learn. Jesus spent 2 years in that camp. He was quiet, diligent, and fiercely determined to never be helpless again. He absorbed everything, learning Spanish more fluently, picking up bits of English from an aid worker's lessons, and listening intently whenever news arrived of the outside world. In 1985, whispers spread through the camp about possible resettlement. Some international organizations were advocating to move refugees to safer places or even other countries. Returning to Guatemala was out of the question. The war still raged, and any returnees would risk death. The Mexican government, while humane in allowing them sanctuary, strictly limited their movement and opportunities. Jesus realized that to have any future, he would have to move farther north. He dreamed of a place he heard about in passing, Estados Unidos, the United States, where one me, this dream was bittersweet, the U.S. Was also known to have supported the Guatemalan military with training and aid during the war, a fact that angered many. But for Jesus, the politics were abstract. What he grasped was that in America he might find a life beyond the barbed wire fences of the refugee camp. That year, a small Gruois and girls in the camp, orphaned like him, quietly made a pact to attempt the journey north. They knew the U.S. did not officially welcome Guatemalan war refugees, often classifying them as economic migrants and sending them back if caught. Still, desperation pushed them. Under cover of a moonless night, Jesus and 4 others slipped out of La Gloria, leaving behind the only tenuous safety they had known. It was a risky move. If Mexican authorities caught He Camp, they could be deported. But courage and youth propelled them forward. They traveled by foot and hitched rides atop freight trains, joining what later generations would call La Bestia, the treacherous network of trains migrants ride through Mexico. For Jesus in the late 1980s, each rattling train ride and dusty road was a step further from the horrors of his homeland and closer to an uncertain promise of freedom. Shashed a new life in the north. After weeks of grueling travel, evading police and immigration checkpoints, Jesus reached the U.S.-Mexico border near Tijuana. By then he was 17, hardened by adversity, yet still youthful enough to be fearless. He and a few companions managed to slip across the border in the dark, trekking through the scrubland into Southern California. The year was 1987 when Jesus set foot in the United States, undocumented and entirely on his own. He had survived genocide and exile, but the challenges of life in America would test him in new ways. At first, Jesus drifted between migrant farm work and odd jobs, blending into the shadows. He picked strawberries in California's Central Valley under a scorching sun, earning a few dollars a day paid under the table. The work was backbreaking, but compared to the refugee camp rations, earning money, real US dollars, felt empowering. He lived in a ramshackle group house with other Latin American migrants. In the evenings, they would share meals of rice and beans and swap stories. Many were Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Mexicans, each with tales of conflict or poverty that had driven them north. Among these newfound friends, Jesus encountered both camaraderie and occasional prejudice. Being Guatemalan and indigenous, he sometimes faced condescension even from other Latinos, but his quiet strength and work ethic earned their respect over time. Though he rarely spoke of it, Jesus carried the fire of memory inside him, the faces of his parents and neighbors, the injustice that had been done. At night, he would replay scenes of his childhood and the war. He did not yet know who had led the attack on his village. The soldiers had been anonymous men in uniforms. But he vowed that if ever he learned a name or a face, he would not forget it. In those days before the internet, information was hard to come by. Jesus learned English gradually, listening to conversations and watching TV in the communal house, and he spent free hours at the public library improving his reading skills. One fateful day, while leafing through an American newspaper from a library discard pile, an article caught his eye. It spoke of a massacre in a Guatemalan village called Las Dos Eres, where over 200 people had been slaughtered, and how one of the perpetrators had been identified years later. The piece mentioned that some of the Guatemalan soldiers responsible for such atrocities had slipped into the U.S. and lived quietly for years. Jesus's heart pounded as he read. Here was validation of what he had lived through, PK and white. The massacre described was in 1982, the same dark year that claimed his own village. Names of Guatemalan officers and soldiers where lie in particular made him freeze, the surname Castañeda. He recognized that name. It was the name painted on the side of one of the trucks that had rolled into his village that day, likely denoting the unit or the officer in charge. In a flash, Jesus realized that the leader of the massacre might have been this Colonel Castañeda, now possibly hiding somewhere in the world. His hands trembled as he tore out the article and folded it into his pocket. From that moment, Jesus's purpose sharpened into a single point. He would find those responsible for his pain. What had been a vague desire for justice became a concrete mission. Over the next decade, Jesus built a modest life in the U.S. He obtained false papers at first to work, and eventually, under a 1990s asylum program change, he managed to regularize his status by proving he was a refugee from the Guatemalan conflict. He moved around, from California to perfect. The saga begins in Tacoma, Washington, behind a boulder near a small outcropping shack. Jesus, spelled however you damn feel that day, is the central figure.